about formation of new periphery, not in terms of old system, but in terms of formation of new periphery within one country, within Russia. Why should we look at poverty and inequalities in this context? First of all, the formation of new structure of Russian labor market, of Russian economic system, and Russian social system of social structure has almost completed by now. And in these new conditions, problems of poverty and inequality look much different from what they looked like 10 or 15 years ago. And in the context of this new structure, the question is not how many people are there in Russia now who are poor, but the question rather is how far the process of their transformation from just being the lower segment of society to the new periphery of Russian society has gone. And that's the question that I would like to address in my presentation. When we talk about new periphery, what do we mean? We mean the segment of the society that differs from the rest of the population in terms of employment, in terms of quality of life, in terms of human capital, in terms of specifics and norms and values. So we can talk about formation of special subculture in this segment of society. And the second question that I would like to address is acuteness of various types of inequalities for poor and non-poor and their attitudes to this, which are also important, and I'll explain later why. So we'll try to answer those questions about how far the transformation process of the poor has gone, basing our research on statistical data and on all Russian surveys that were carried out by Institute of Sociology during the last 10 years. And first of all, I have to say that diagnostics of the situation with poverty largely depends on the indicators that we use to measure it. There are different indicators that are used to measure poverty, and they're officially adopted in Russia, and the most known one is absolute poverty. When we consider poor, all the households that have the incomes below minimal subsistence level. Minimal subsistence level is set by law in Russian conditions. So this is the official statistics for Russia, and we can see that the poverty rate has declined quite rapidly during the last 10 years, and the situation seems quite optimistic. But unfortunately, even if we look just on the statistics data, we can still see some problems, some challenges that are getting even worse. First of all, it's mass poverty of employed people. Low salaries of working individuals create a situation where a lot of people who are working are still poor, so work doesn't solve the problem of poverty. And considering the fact that the minimum wage is set on the level which is lower than the minimal subsistence level, the situation is not going to improve anytime soon. The second problem, the second challenge for social politics is that there are increasingly more children in poor households. For example, share of households with children under 16 years old, the total number of households is about 1/3, and in the group among income-based poor reaches 60%. So it's the largest group among income-based poor in Russia. And these two problems, poverty of employed and children in poor household, are very closely connected to one with another. First of all, low incomes of the large share of populations automatically drive them into poverty when a child is born, and especially if we talk about second child. And at the same time, having a child in the family in current Russian institutional conditions creates drastically reduces chances for at least one parent in the labor market because of the problems with kindergarten, problems with schooling, and so on and so forth. So these two problems are really connected, and as a result, we find more and more children in poor households, but this is determined not by their family situation, but more of by the situation on the labor market. And at the same time, Russian politics, Russian social politics that should be aimed with fighting with poverty, doesn't really address the problems of the labor market. So these two problems remain, and they will become more and more complicated with time. But this is just the part where we talk about absolute poverty. But absolute poverty doesn't give us the full picture of the poverty and the poor in Russian society. So to get a more complex and more comprehensive look, we'll use the second approach as well. It's a relative approach to poverty. According to this approach, people are considered poor if their income and resources are insufficient for having a standard of living that is considered acceptable for a particular country. It can be measured in different ways. The first one, the simpler one, is monetaristic approach, where we consider poor everyone who has an income that is lower than a certain part of the median or average income of the society. That's how we take into account the standard of living that is acceptable in particular society. So it can be from 40 to 60%. In different European countries use different levels of it. And the second approach, which is also quite widespread, and this is the approach that we used in this particular research, is deprivation-based poverty. In this case, we look at the deprivations of various kinds that household experiences, and the deprivations that are not customary for the majority of the country's population and that are associated with poverty. So we have a list of 11 indicators for this particular research that we used. If we apply both of these approaches to measuring poverty to the data, this is the data from the Institute of Sociology, so this is not statistical but sociological data, we get the following results. We have about 9% of income-based poverty, and that's quite close to the official statistics that we have. But deprivation-based poverty is much more, is much bigger, much larger share. It's 25%. So it's about 1/4 of the population experience deprivations of such a kind that they are not considered to be, that are not supposed to be customary for the Russian society. If we look at the united group of poor people, we see that their base for formation of new periphery, and I'll argue later that this is exactly the platform for formation of new periphery, comprise of about 30% of the Russian population. So we can see that these two groups, they overlap but only in part. In fact, they complement each other. Why is this happening? 25% of the population have sufficient income, which sets them higher than the subsistence level, but at the same time, the cause of their poverty might be rooted in the specifics of their expenses. For example, they can live in a particular type of settlement that requires higher expenses, or they can have some member of the family who is sick and needs medications that are quite expensive, or they can have alcohol problems, anything. So their poverty is based on the specific of their expenses, and it is not captured by the absolute approach, which is officially used in Russia. I would also like to mention that if we look at the dynamics of these two types of poverty, and we can do this because we have the data for the last 10 and 15 years, we can see that the income-based poverty has reduced quite significantly, and that reflects the same results as we can get from the Russian Statistical Bureau. But at the same time, deprivation-based poverty has reduced, but not quite as much. And there are about 20% of the people who are suffering from deprivation-based poverty, but not from income-based poverty. And this figure is consistent, almost consistent for the last 10 years. But again, I have to say that since it's not reflected in the official statistics, there are almost virtually no measures of social policy that aim at this group of helping them to get out of their situation. And I also have to say that there are about 4 to 5%, depending on the year that we look, of people who are in deep and stagnant poverty, chronic poverty, that lasts over than 5 years, and they experience both income-based poverty and deprivation-based poverty. So when combining these two approaches, I'm arguing that this 30% is the platform of formation for the new periphery in Russian society, in Russian social structure. Why can we talk about new periphery? First of all, if you look at the most important indicators, it's opportunity that reflects their opportunities on the labor market, we can see that the situation with poor and non-poor groups are very, very different. It's very different in terms of their education. We can see that for non-poor, there's quite a large share of people who have higher education or at least professional training. For income-based and deprivation-based poor, there are quite a large share of people who have incomplete secondary and secondary education. These differences in educational level reflects in the professional positions that they hold in the current structure of Russian economy. Again, we can see that the picture is very different for non-poor group and for the poor group. For the poor groups, no matter what kind of poor we are talking about income-based or deprivation-based. They're very similar in this respect. So we can see that while among the non-poor, highly skilled professionals are the largest group, it comprises about 30%. For the poor, income-based and deprivation-based, the largest groups are low-skilled and unskilled workers. And They also work on the semi-professional positions as well. The risks of getting into poverty exceed 50% for two groups, for semi-skilled workers and low-skilled workers. So more than 50% of each of these groups are in the income-based or deprivation-based poverty. So we can say that Russian poverty is above all determined by where an individual stands on the labor market. And that makes it quite different from the situation that was 20 years ago and even 10 years ago, when a large share of Russian population was poor, but the professional structure of the poor and non-poor groups was much more similar. And another aspect that I would like to mention here is that poor mostly hold jobs on the secondary labor market. So it's temporary employment, it's unstable employment, and that reflected in the fact that they assess the risk of unemployment much higher than the poor, non-poor groups, and they also have virtually no social security support, and so on and so forth. So this concentration of the poor groups on the secondary labor market also is a trend, is a new trend for the last 10 years. And at the same time, I have to repeat that countries' social and economic policies are not aimed at solving this situation, at fighting structural prerequisites for the poverty. So the problem probably won't be solved anytime soon as well. Now let us look at the characteristics of lifestyle and living standards of the poor. Why is it important? Because if we talk about new periphery, different living standards and different lifestyles can consolidate the position of the poor as a new periphery in Russian society. And unfortunately, from the data, we see that it is happening. First of all, we can say that poor cannot adequately satisfy even basic physiological needs in food, in clothes, in living situation. And that makes their situation quite different from the situation with non-poor groups. And the more important thing is that the past decade has led to the worsening of their situation. So if we compare this assessment of the poor of different aspects of life that we have today and the same assessment that they gave 10 years ago, we can see that almost in all aspects of their life, they're saying that their position has become worse. It is reflected not only in these four indicators, of course, it's reflected in other tendencies that we can see from the data as well. It is accumulating of the debts that is happening for the poor, again, income-based and deprivation poor as well. It's decrease in ownership of property that they got through privatization 20 years ago, but now it seems like they have to sell some of the property that they had before, like duchies or some kind of land if they had some, in order to still have some kind of minimum living standard. At the same time, the only indicator that is getting better is the possession of durable goods. So it seems like they're exchanging property for the durable goods, and that is the channel that they use the free money if they ever have any. They're spending them on durable goods. And we can talk about the reasons of it, but I guess I'll skip it now. It's another interesting thing. And another aspect that support the conclusion that the poor are becoming a new periphery and their status of the new periphery as a new periphery is consolidated is the use of paid social services. Again, we can see that the picture is very different. And why is this use of paid social services so important? Because if we talk about educational services, medical services for themselves or for their children, that basically means investment in the human capital of themselves and the human capital for their children. And we can see that they can't afford those services, and the most disturbing part is they very rarely use this educational or health improving services for their children. So that means that children from poor families grow up with a priori worse human capital assets versus their peers, and their families have non-economic resources to help them overcome this trend. So all of this contributes to the trend of intergenerational reproduction of poverty, and it probably will be getting stronger. Another thing that also differentiates poor and non-poor population is that they basically impossible for the poor population to significantly improve their lives in any of the aspects. As we can see again, the picture is very different for the poor and for the non-poor population. While 2/3 of non-poor population said that during the last 3 years they managed to achieve at least some improvements in their lives, maybe on the labor market with job promotion, maybe with their living situation, maybe with their financial situation. Still, 2/3 have some improvement. For the poor, 80 and 92%, depending on which approach we used, say that they have achieved none of the above in the past 3 years. Again, if we talk about trends, that means that their position is consolidated and that it's even getting worse because they can change their life in any way that they want to. All of this allows us to say that poverty issue, despite the improvement that we see with the official statistics indicator, the poverty issue didn't become less important for Russian society, and it gets even more complicated over time, even though statistical indicators show some improvement in this area. And today, poor Russians are characterized by different dynamics of this position. So basically, their position is getting worse during the last 10 years versus the non-poor groups. They're characterized by high risk of intergenerational reproduction of poverty, both because there are more children being born in poor families and because they can't afford any investments in human capital and any economic resources to strengthen their position. And different chances in terms of employment, in terms of labor market, in terms of consumption, and in terms of human capital. And all of this consolidate their peripheral position in the Russian society. At the same time, if we talk about peripheral position of the poor in Russian society, we have to address the question of norms and values as well. Of course, once again, that is just one small illustration of what I'm trying to say. So the question is whether there is a special subculture being formed in the poor segment of the population. Are they characterized by a subculture that is different from the from the other population of the country? Because if there is a special subculture, it will also consolidate their peripheral status. I have to say that the results show that so far there is no values gap between poor and non-poor people. But still, if we analyze some norms, values and attitudes, and especially those that are usually associated with modern societies, so that's internal locus of control, self-expression values, individualism, choice of equality of opportunity over equality of income, then we can see some differences. And these differences are especially striking if we talk about the core of this periphery, chronic poor and non-poor people. And especially, we can see that the differences are especially big if we talk about different choices between equality of opportunity and equality of income. So for the most part of the population, for the most share of population, equality of opportunity is more important than equality of incomes. For the poor, the situation is different. And again, it's important not only because we analyze just one this indicator and we can say that they prefer equality of opportunity or equality of income. That basically means that they will have different prerequisites for the government policy, that they will have different requests for their social policy. And that also means that the poor doesn't really have a base for consolidation with other groups of population when talking about protecting their interests and sharing their requests towards the government. And again, this conclusion is reflected in many other different indicators, and first of all, in behavioral strategies that poor people imply to improve their situation. But probably we should talk not about behavioral strategies, but absence of any behavioral strategies. As we can see, quite a significant share of the poor didn't take any actions because they believe that they can't do anything to improve their situation. And again, this is quite different from the non-poor groups. But we can describe this situation as a relaxed fatalism among the poor. No, it's not, because there is no relaxation at all. So everyday state of mind for them is usually fierce, unable to influence what's happening among them, feeling of injustice of what's going on around them. And again, on all these indicators, the situation is quite different for the poor from what it is for non-poor groups. So they experience much worse psychological conditions as well. If we talk about formation of new periphery, we need to talk about social inequality as well, because increasing gap between poor and non-poor people that I tried to show that represents itself not only in their economic and living condition, but also in their values, in their social psychological condition. This increasing gap is more, it seems to be especially dangerous in the context of expressive social inequality that exists in Russia. And in this case, I have to say that even official statistics, which is different from the situation with the poverty, even the official statistics indicates that the situation with inequality in Russia is getting worse over the years. So we can see that Gini coefficient has been growing and the decile ratio is growing as well. And again, that is for the whole Russia. If we talk about cities, of course, it's much bigger there. But what's more important is not inequality as such, but attitudes of inequality, attitudes of population towards inequality and different inequality types. And these statistical figures are reflected at the micro level in the fact that most Russians, and this is the picture for all Russians, not for just for the poor part, that all Russians feel that inequality in Russia is excessively deep and illegitimate, and this feeling is typical for all social groups of population. Not depending on their differences in income, differences in age, and so on and so forth. Only 4% think that, of all Russians think that there are no painful inequalities in our society today. And 14 people think that they do not personally experience any inequalities themselves. And the most important one, the most painful one, is income inequality, as you can see from the graph. What is interesting here is that, once again, it's typical for the whole society, and that also is reflected in this graph. When people talk about income inequality, they usually say, 71% of them say that it's painful for society in general, but only 47% say that they experience it themselves. And that is true for almost all types of inequalities that are presented on the picture. So usually Russians tend to say that these problems exist in society, and less of them saying that they experience it themselves. If we talk about poor and non-poor groups, I have to say that the rating of the inequalities in these groups turned out to be similar. So the general order of them is the same. And if we talk about inequalities that are painful for society in general, poor people have almost identical answers to this question as non-poor groups. But if we talk about inequalities that affect them personally, then poor people tend to be more expressive about that. So the larger share of people say that they experience different kinds of inequalities themselves. But still, again, it's a big problem for the whole society, not just for the poor groups. The conclusion that people think that the differences in income are too great and that they suffer from the self are also represented in the answers to this question. So if we look at the picture of how Russians evaluate justice of income and property distribution, we can see that for almost all Russians, differences in income seems to be too great, too big in Russia today. 83% agree with that. Again, it didn't depend on the income level of the respondent, on the group that he belonged to, and the figure was very close in the poor groups. At the same time, a slightly less share said that they personally get significantly smaller compensation at work than they deserve. So again, they're concerned with the society in whole, and that reflects their dissatisfaction with the rules of the game that are accepted in Russian society now, with the institutional conditions that exist in the society now. At the same time, we can say that this is happening because Russians reject and don't accept any types of inequalities. That is not true. They accept, they have quite a great degree of tolerance towards inequality, but only if this inequality is based on legitimate and just reasons that are behind it. And that is reflected in the fact that most Russians agree that it's only fair that those who are faster and more efficient at work get a higher salary than those who occupy the same position but are less efficient. And that is true again for all Russians, for poor and for non-poor groups as well. So the first condition, the first prerequisite for the inequality to be just, to be fair, is efficient work. The second prerequisite that is also supposed to be a good reason for inequality is earning different amount of money in conditions of equal opportunities. And the third one is education. So people again tend to agree that those who are more educated should earn more. So we can conclude that Russian people do not, we can say that Russian people do not accept any inequalities. And in fact, they have quite high tolerance for those inequalities that are based on fair and fair reasons, fair factors. And the same is true for the poor people, as we can see from this graph. They usually show a little less tolerance, but still, the general trend is they are ready to accept great inequalities in income if they are based on the reasons that are found legitimate. At the same time, the degree of inequality that exists in Russian society today, to all groups, it seems too big and illegitimate in its reasons. So the difference between poor and the rest of the population are not so much about the attitudes to the existing inequalities and the causes that makes them this legitimate because they agree on this, but about the fact that these groups differently assess importance of these inequalities for themselves. And that's why poor have a little less tolerance for the inequalities in general. So, to give a conclusion, what I've said so far. First of all, we should know that the position of the poor became worse over the period of the last 10 years. And that is reflected in their assessment of different aspects of their lives, assessment in their ability to use paid social services, in presence of opportunities for improving their lives. So the position of the poor group is getting worse. Partly it can be explained by the change in the portrait of Russian poverty, because the people who are more well off and who had the resources to get out of poverty, who had professional status and education enough to get to the higher levels of the society, they managed to get out of the group during the economic growth. But the main change is not the changing of the portrait of Russian poverty, but the process of their transformation from being just a lower income social segment into the social periphery of the society. And that is due to several trends that were happening during this last 10 years. First of all, social gap became and still becomes deeper, which is reflected again in statistics and sociological data as well. And this deepening of the social gap doesn't mean the appearance of the rich poor Russians, rich new Russians. It means the creation of the new position for Russian society, new poor Russians as well. So it's an increase of the gap towards both directions. The second trend is the professional portrait of the Russian poverty, and I was talking about this. It's not only their education and professional status, but increasing utilization on the secondary labor market with its unstable jobs and unstable pay, no social benefits, and so on and so forth. Another trend is that there are different factors that contribute to the intergenerational stagnation of the poverty group, and I also talked about this. That is both investments in social and human capital and cultural capital, and growth of the children in poor households. Then it's the decrease in the quality of cultural and human capital of the poor. And finally, social inequalities that are pluralizing, they're becoming deeper, they're becoming more diverse, and they concentrate again in the group of poor, no matter if you talk about income-based poor or deprivation-based poor. So as a result, we can say that the transformation of the poor from being just a low-income social segment into the new periphery really takes place and probably has passed the point of no return. Thank you.
Miss, many questions, please.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I have a small practical question. You told at the beginning of the presentation that income-based poverty is about 9%, and deprivation-based poverty is about 25%. Then how do you get new periphery at 30%?
Because these groups, they overlap.
You count this difference in 5%, almost. You have counted it, that the difference is 5%.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
We just we applied both approaches and we got a number.
Actually, I had the same question.
No, the same question, yeah.
Methodological, but just a little bit further. So, your results in your sample, they're proportion of people who are either income poor or deprived based poor is higher than official statistics, right?
No, actually, for the income-based poor, we are very close to official statistics because we give a smaller number.
Okay.
It's 9%, and according to official
So
statistics,
deprived
it was
based
11%.
is like more accurate estimation for
Well, they're different. They're very different. It depends on what we are talking about. Actually, absolute poverty is used to measure the level of survival, as we can say. And if we talk about deprivational poverty, we're not talking about survival anymore, but we talk about lifestyle and about level of life that is acceptable, that is typical for the society as a whole. So they're kind of different approaches. But if we want to talk about poverty in Russia, I think that we should use both of them because it gives us more comprehensive picture of what's happening.
Please, your question.
Thank you for your speech. I have one question. You use such term as periphery, and can you propose some model of geographical structure of this inequality, or it's not possible?
Well, I wouldn't say that I can propose a geographical structure, but I can give some trends that are happening because we looked at the different portraits of the poor. So absolute poverty tends to be concentrated in the rural areas, in quite big households with many children, with many pensioners. But these are just some aspects of the problem in rural areas. If we talk about deprivation-based poverty, it's more typical for cities, again because of what I said, because it depends more on the structure of expenses of them, and in cities we more often encounter different problems like having to spend money on more expensive medicine and so on and so forth.
So from your viewpoint, periphery can be a phenomenon of big city, such as a phenomenon of some villages and so on.
If we talk about deprivation-based poverty.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you. I have two small questions. First of all, is there any estimations of relative poverty that take into account informal economy and informal income? First of all, of the richest.
Yeah, I'm sure there are some researchers dealing with this, but in this particular research we didn't use monetary approach at all, so we used just deprivation-based poverty. There are some people who are working with the monetary approach.
Yes, and the second question, as I know that there's a coefficient of, funds coefficient just before the October revolution was about 25. Nowadays it's about 16. Is there any correlation of social inequality and social protests? Maybe you know some investigations on this.
Well, that's an interesting question, but I can't answer it right now, but that's a very interesting thought for the investigation.
Please, Professor Zaras.
I think Svetlana presented a very comprehensive empirical picture of the inequality, and your argument in favor of this phenomenon is very persuasive. But I still don't recognize and understand your treatment of the source of this problem, because it seems that the idea that transformation of poor from just a lower income social segment in the new periphery is just another way of saying that new periphery appeared. What is the reason for this, especially in the period from 2003 to 2007, before the world economic crisis hit Russia?
Well, that's also a very good and very complex question. I would say that our data points to the problems to the labor market. That labor market and economic structure is the main prerequisite for the formation of this new periphery, new type of poverty.
Economic structure?
Economic structure,
Do
yeah.
you mean the structure of industries comprising Russian economy, or some other aspect of economic structure?
Well, structure, first of all, it's structure of incomes in different industries, because different industries seems to be the base for inequality, more than the efforts that people take. And secondly, I would say that the problem with the poverty of working people, the problem of the low salary, it's also contributed to this formation of the periphery. So in general, it's not a social problem, it's a socio-economic problem, and the roots, the structural prerequisites for the poverty that lie in the labor market. At least that's what our data points to.
Thank you.
Have you estimated the role of ethnic factor or non-legal migrants which are in Russian in huge way?
Unfortunately, in this sample, we didn't take it into account. It's also a good question for the investigation.
And can you say about the factors which influence people to have the more probability to be in the group of power or non-power? What are the factors? I mean, like second children, means that you have much more probability to be power or good or changing job or second job. So what is the general like source, but factors which influence poverty, because it's like portrait description.
Well, right now we're working on the model that will help us to determine the different factors and their input in the poverty. But I would say just some preliminary things that, again, for absolute poverty, for absolute and deprivation-based poverty, the type of settlement plays quite a big role on the type of poverty that you can get into. But in general, on the chances of getting into the poor or non-poor group, education, professional status, and family situation. But again, it's kind of complicated issue because, as I said, family situation, it's very close to the chances on labor market, so it's very hard to distinguish them, to say which is primary and which is secondary. But basically, that's it. That's education, professional status, that's family situation. And according to our research, we try to analyze this problem of culture of poverty, which is also kind of another trend, another direction in all the poverty-based research. But in case of Russia, it seems like the culture, the formation of subculture, the different norms and values, it's not the factor that drives people into poverty. When they're into poverty, this special subculture is formed, but it's not the factor that leads them to become poor or non-poor, that they don't want to be, that they don't want to work, they don't want to be efficient. That doesn't seem to be a problem. So it's structural factors again.
And children suffer from poverty to much more degree than population in average.
Yeah, it's a big problem of more and more children in poor
Yes,
households.
and it impacts negatively, of course, on the quality of the future human capital.
And that's again intergenerational reproduction of this group, so it becomes consolidated, it becomes self-reproducing. That's also part of the problem of new periphery, not just poverty, but new periphery of Russian society.
Yeah, this
I have a very brief question. What's your kind of theoretical framework on understanding this periphery? Is it an outcome of interplay of domestic socio-economic factors, or it's an interrelationship between domestic and global factors? Basically, is Russian population drifting towards periphery because of internal decline, or because it's integrating into the global periphery or semi-periphery?
I would say it's domestic factors first, primary domestic factors, and again, it's very hard to find the connection of which comes first and which comes second. But Russia is driven to the periphery of the world system also because of its some economic conditions that it has, labor market, economic structure, so on and so forth. On the international level, it reflects in drifting of Russia towards the periphery of the world system. On the domestic level, it reflects in more and more people on such structural positions that do not let them to come out of poverty.
okay. So, please, your question.
Thanks. So this is a really interesting descriptive picture. Since this is very empirical research, I'll allow myself a very narrow empirical observation on this one set of questions on tolerance of inequality. It was really an interesting set of findings. But of the 4 statements that you've shown us, they're all essentially phrased in they all code in one direction. Right? So I worry a little bit about acquiescence bias in those, and would like to see or wonder if you've asked that battery of questions where there's one that's asked in it inversely.
I think I talked about 2 questions, but there were, 1 second. They were phrased differently. So the first 2 positions is the difference in incomes are too great, and you personally get a significantly smaller, so they've phrased negatively. Then we had positively phrased statements as well. People in Russia get adequate compensation for their intellectual abilities and qualifications.
Yeah, it was a set of agree-disagree statements about what's fair or unfair in terms of income inequality. So like if different groups.
Okay,
That set,
these were phrased only in this way, unfortunately, but we also had questions about fairness and unfairness of use of paid medical services and paid educational services of people with different incomes. They were phrased differently, but so it was easier to analyze them as well, considering their tolerance to their inequality, but still it shows the same results, that inequality, the tolerance of Russia towards inequality, we can say that it's low. It's fine that it's very comparable to the tolerance of inequality in other countries, because this question was also used in SSP, I guess, SSP in 2009, so we can compare Russia by their tolerance or intolerance to inequalities to different countries as well. And the Russians do not show high intolerance to all inequalities. That is not true.
So